Hey everybody, welcome back to another review, and this time we are talking about Iron Man Execute Program, which is the Iron Man Volume 4 collection of numbers 7 through 12, and it's written by Charlie and Daniel Knopf, who are a father-son team. Daniel Knopf's actually a pretty famous TV writer, and his son, I actually haven't seen his son do anything else. But Daniel Knopf's been kind of all over the place. He's done writing for Supernatural. He wrote that old 90s TV movie, Blind Justice. He did Fear Itself. He did... there was a Dracula show that I think has since been canceled that I know he worked on. And I know he's done stuff with Stephen S. Knight for Spartacus, which is mainly where I know him from. But yeah, he's a TV guy, and he got brought in 2000, I want to say 2005 or 2000, no, it's 2006 actually. He got brought in 2006 with his son to write Iron Man. And they pretty much stayed on the book for most of Volume 4. They were there from issues 17 through 18, and then 21 through 28, and then 19 and 20 are a War Machine story, so they didn't write that. So this is the first volume of their run on Iron Man. It's the first 6 issues, and the reason this book ends the way it does, and it's placed the way it does, and why it's immediately interrupted by Civil War, is because Daniel Knopf and Charlie Knopf were on deck to do Iron Man after Warren Ellis. And Warren Ellis did Extremis, and Extremis for like the first, I want to say 2 or 3 issues, was pretty good. You know, it came out on its regular schedule. After that, it got delayed ridiculously. There was just a massive delay with that book. And so Daniel and Charlie Knopf had this Execute Program 6-issue story planned out for months and months and months and never got to do it because they had to wait for Warren Ellis to wrap up. And so finally they did wrap up, and what sucks for them is that by the time Warren Ellis did wrap up, their story was about to hit during the Civil War, during the Marvel Civil War. And so they took the Execute Program and they altered parts of it to help kind of set up Tony's worldview for Civil War when that was about to hit. And they talk a lot about what happened to them while trying to write this, the differences they had to deal with, and how, at the end of the day, they're not really happy about Civil War. They're not really happy about their deal with Marvel in general, not because they seem to have any ill will towards them, but they're disappointed by this particular era of throwing Tony under the bus. Tony Stark is thrown under the bus all the way through Volume 4. Volume 4 is just not his run, really. Which is a shame, because Warren Ellis has a lot to, like, redefine Tony, and then after that, everything just kind of becomes about making Tony do things that, even if there are in his character, are written poorly by other writers. And that's the big thing that they mention, is that it's not a problem, necessarily, that Ed Brubaker or anyone else during this time is writing a book where Tony Stark shows up and Tony Stark's a jerk, because those books aren't focusing on Tony. So it's not their job, really, to understand the voice as much as they do. But at the same time, they don't like the fact that their run was tainted by this massive comic community outrage against Iron Man. And just as a company, the fact that Marvel had basically turned Tony into a supervillain, which is kind of what happens with the movies. The idea that Joss Whedon talks a lot about how Tony is kind of just a supervillain, and that's sort of what he has to deal with. So that's kind of the setup for this run, which is why in places it's written kind of awkwardly. Issue 1 doesn't gel with the rest of the run. Well, issue 7 really of the first of this story. Issue 7 doesn't really gel with the rest of this, and then issue 12 ends really melodramatically when the last line of the book is basically saying that last time I checked, guns required registration, and then its end. The next thing you read is Civil War Iron Man. Like it's kind of altered in places to do stuff like that, and that's at the end of the day the biggest problem with it. Now, enough with all that. Let's go ahead and talk about this. So, Iron Man Volume 4 comes right off of the heels of Avengers Disassembled. Extremis has happened. Extremis makes barely any reference to the main Marvel Universe as it is. And then, around this period, New Avengers have started. And I want to say Breakout has either already happened or just happened. Or maybe it's happening during this. I don't remember off the top of my head. But New Avengers is now a thing, and so there's a different Avengers team, and it instantly feels tonally very different than what Warren Ellis was doing with Extremis. And that's, again, part of the problem with reading Extremis is that as a ongoing issue 6 does not bleed into issue 7. And so if you read these back to back, they're just a little bit jarring. Tony has become far more aggressive. Extremis has allowed him to do so much and learn so much and kind of become so powerful that he's sort of dehumanized. And they talk about, Daniel and Charlie Knopf in their interviews, they talk about how Iron Man through his whole history has been defined by weaknesses, not in the same way as Daredevil, but in an interestingly similar way, where the first thing you know about Iron Man when you read the Stan Lee stuff is, oh, he's got a big metal thing on his chest. He's like a big playboy businessman, and now he can't, like, do that sort of physicality because he's got a big metal plate. And then he becomes an alcoholic, and then that's something in the Michelini and Layton run that they liked, and then they liked it more in the Dennis O'Neil run because he's literally on the street at that point. And then Joe Quesada brings that artificial heart thing back with the sentient armor, which is sort of retconned and brought back with the Mike Grell stuff. And so Iron Man's always got some sort of weakness. And so they thought part of what makes Extremis interesting is that this is a Tony Stark who is not weak and overcoming, but too powerful and has to dumb down. I think immediately that's kind of interesting. And I liked that. I like that a lot of this would be handled better in the Matt Fraction stuff, but I like that they kind of want to play with that reversal. And they want to isolate Tony because that's something he always does, but in a different way. It's the same notion of power where, like, Joss Whedon talks about how he finds two things very interesting and they're both power. One is having too much and one is having not enough. And that's where Tony is always at. He's always jumping back and forth between that. And it's usually not having enough power. It's usually him being in a particular place and constantly hitting circumstances that he either can't control or doesn't want to control. And so he's kind of forcefully isolated by things outside of his power. And now with Extremis, nothing is. And so it's the kind of thing that makes him reflect back on himself and think, like, this could have been so handy so many other places. And it's like an interesting breakdown of what Tony does with technology and how technology influences him as both a moral being and just as an everyday person. So there's a little bit of stuff here where Tony gets more aggressive. When he's fighting the Crimson Dynamo, one of his tactics to defeat him is to stop his heart and then reactivate it so he's just knocked down. And then him and Cap get into an argument over it. So Captain America's like, I could have thought of at least 4 different ways to stop him. And Tony's like, yeah, I could have thought of 7. This is the quickest. And it's very much about Tony not being of the same standard as the rest of the world anymore. And I like, interestingly, that before Civil War happens, both Captain America and Tony Stark are super soldiers. They're just super soldiers in different ways. And they're both, I feel like, what Extremis does to Tony is exactly what the super soldier serum did to Captain America for the movies. The original comics didn't have this particular tweak into it, but the way Joe Johnston does it in First Avenger is the super soldier serum enhances who you are. So bad becomes worse and good becomes better. So taking that into account, that's kind of what happens to Tony here, where, like, everything, if he got that version of super soldier serum, he'd handle it exactly the same way he's handling Extremis, which is he's thinking too quickly. He's become too powerful in places. And that's one of my problems with Extremis as a concept, is that it makes Tony Stark way too powerful. And here they really deal with that. They really deal with the fact that he's almost a god in ways, because he can see through satellites. There's a scene here where he's using the armor to take out Gravitron with the Avengers, while at the same time using his computer to work on some problem somewhere else, while at the same time using a projection to talk to people at his company, all at the same time, just running off of his brain. And it's almost as if he didn't overexert himself the way he did, he'd be driven mad by just how much connectivity he's got. And I think that's really interesting. I like a lot of what they do with Tony going off the deep end, but of course this is the era of throwing Tony on the bus, and so what we do here is that we turn him into the villain, we turn him into the bad guy for a while, and I like the setup, right? Like, I think if you just started Iron Man with Volume 4, if you're just a new Iron Man fan, then what they do here with isolating Tony and putting him on the run and framing him for a crime he didn't commit, all that stuff is interesting because it's a different sort of power discussion. It's Tony's now, in a really literal sense, one of the most powerful people in the Marvel Universe. But his morality and his connection to people has weakened so much that he's forced out and he's on the run. I think thematically all that's really interesting. My problem is, Iron Man has a someone took control of my armor, I'm being framed, runaway story all the freaking time. And it's not even, in places it's ridiculous. Like, the disguise Tony puts on here with the blonde hair and shaving and everything is exactly the same disguise he uses in the Manhunt story, in the previous Volume 3 story arc. Tony has done this, has gone and been framed for something and went into hiding to solve a problem so many times that at this point it's just a stale concept for a story. And seeing this as a reinvigoration, seeing this from the perspective of someone that doesn't read Iron Man, I can see why this is really entertaining and really fun, and in places, how it's definitely a much deeper story than just the novelty of seeing Tony run away. But as an Iron Man fan, I've seen this happen so many times that it just bores me as a concept. Even so, I think it's executed really well. I think this is much better than the Manhunt story, mostly because Tony running away has a thematic point. The stuff with the other Tony stories, sometimes they were interesting and sometimes they weren't, but particularly with Manhunt, it was just a situation. There's some post 9/11 commentary in there, but not enough at the forefront. It was just kind of Tony Stark meets Fugitive. And here, it really is part of Tony's character arc and part of his journey and part of the social commentary of this particular story that Tony has to run away and turn into a different person. And I like that. I think that's kind of interesting. And you get some pretty fun you get some pretty fun imagery here and there in places that I think that's kind of fun, like Tony looking like Captain America. That back in some of the Volume 3 stuff, Tony's passwords to some things were called Captain America. I think that's fun. I like that. Before we get to the Civil War punching these guys out, they were already arguing about Tony getting too powerful and Tony Stark almost looking exactly like him for a little bit. I think that's fun. Now, part of the problem with Tony getting too powerful is, and I guess maybe this is almost a null point because I'm talking about the Sentry now, who is just way too powerful. There's a scene here where Tony fights the Sentry, and Tony defeats him pretty badly. It's crazy just how easily Tony's able to take him out. Now, obviously, in the moment, it's kind of a crisis situation, but it doesn't take him more than like a page or so to completely disarm him. And if he wanted to, he could have kept him there like that forever. And it's kind of irritating that Tony is so powerful now, and no one will ever treat him like he is. You're going to get scenes later in Civil War where there are people that are fighting Tony Stark that should not even be on the same classification that he's on. And that's really irritating, that they're not able to stay consistent with how strong he's become. If you can take out the Sentry in the span of a page, Captain America should never be able to lay a finger on him. Well, he's on Extremis, that is. And that's just kind of a problem overall. Speaking of things from the past volumes with the Frank Thierry run and the Joe Quesada run, we had the Sons of Yinsen. And after this newly formed origin and some like more interesting psychological role of Yinsen in Tony's character arc, we have the Son of Yinsen show up again, not in any way connected to the Sons of Yinsen religious group, but the actual physical kid of Yinsen that blames Tony for a lot of what's happened and is trying to get revenge on him. And he's the guy that's been framing Tony. He's the one that's been hacking into Extremis and making Tony kill people, which is really interesting. They don't do anything with it, sadly. I feel like the stuff with the Son of Yinsen was supposed to be bigger. I feel like reading the story that character was supposed to be a bigger part of what Tony's arc is and Tony's worldview is and what he wants to do going forward and maybe return more in later arcs, and he never does, because I think the end of this, because it's very heavy-handed, I think the end of this is forcing Civil War too much to the point where that character's role was reduced, and that's definitely a problem. Iron Man does this thing here where now that he's got Extremis and he can control so much technology at once, he's building like a legion of Iron Men, like a Hulkbuster and like a Driller and like a Volcano Explorer, kind of different series of suits. And I think that's kind of cool. I like that, how much of that feeds into later with Age of Ultron. And I think that's a good idea. I think that's kind of where Tony naturally would have gone with this power, and it's not throwing him under the bus, it's just a situation forcing him to destroy those suits, and I think that's interesting. There's a character in this, a diplomat, that is like brokering talks between terrorist groups in the United States and other countries and such. He's basically like this all-star diplomat that becomes a recurring character after this. I know I'm going to butcher his name, which is why I'm just referring to him as a diplomat, but I'm going to try and find it here and see if I can maybe pronounce it. Basically what this guy does is that Tony is being hunted while there is this peace summit going on, and that guy is one of the targets on Son of Yinsen's list. And the new Secretary of State that has taken over is trying to oust Nick Fury. There's lots of dialogue here where he's like, if you don't prevent Stark from doing this, then you're going to lose your post, and yada yada yada. And there's definitely a lot of animosity between S.H.I.E.L.D. and this new Secretary of Defense. And it's an interesting contrast between Tony's time as Secretary of Defense, and it again hurts Extremis because Extremis doesn't make reference to any of that at all, but this is very clearly building off the John J. Miller stuff. And so this Secretary of Defense also becomes a recurring character and has a lot to do with what's going on in the book later politically. But there is a diplomat guy named Karim Mawash Najib, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure, that Tony is about to target but survives through this and becomes a bigger character, not in the Civil War trade, but later when you get to Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Haunted in particular. So I did want to mention him here. Both Sal Kennedy and Maya Hansen are back, because Tony doesn't have Pepper and Happy Hogan anymore. Happy Hogan's going to come in a little bit next volume, so we'll talk about that there. Sal Kennedy is annoyingly retroactive, because this run is building so much on stuff pre-Extremis, and this character is being treated as if he's been there since the very beginning, and he hasn't, and that bugs me. I haven't been with him long enough for me to buy that Tony, when he's having a mental breakdown, would go to him. He's supposed to be written as like this wise mentor figure of Tony's, and the fact that we so rarely saw him in Extremis, and the fact that he hasn't shown up ever before Extremis, is a bit of a problem just when you're looking at this as a part of Iron Man's ongoing history. Sal Kennedy's going to become even bigger when it comes to the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff. And then Maya Hansen's in jail, and she's attacked by a former inmate because of the collateral damage caused by Malin. And so there's a lot more collateral damage stuff that goes into the later Civil War thing, and then Tony breaks her out, and so Sal Kennedy Maya Hansen and Tony are working together to try and figure out this plot, all devised by the son of Yinsen. This is good. I like Execute Program. I think it's really good. I like Knopf's, Charlie Knopf and Daniel Knopf's run a lot, for the most part. This particular volume is plagued by just historical context, and clearly being written one way and altered later because it had to start tying into Civil War, even though it was never intended to. The writers talk a lot about how this story was supposed to hit before Civil War. They had this ready for months, and then because Extremis was so late, they had to alter it. And so that's definitely a problem. And it feels awkward towards the end, particularly when Tony goes on that speech about how we need accountability, how I killed all those people under the control of someone else, I should be punished for it. And so he talks about how superpowers are loaded guns, but last time I checked, guns required registration. So that feeds directly into the next volume when we talk about Civil War. At the same time, though, it's setting up stuff that happens later with Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. when it comes to, like, the new Secretary of Defense leaning on Fury really hard, and this diplomat guy that's going to factor into the Mandarin stuff. And so there's a lot going on here that isn't just limited to Civil War. But it feels kind of awkward because it both requires you to know some of your Iron Man history, going back to this Iron Secretary stuff, and even further back with some of the relationships between Stark and S.H.I.E.L.D., and then sometimes it's asking you to forget that for what Extremis is doing, and then sometimes it's asking you to just bear with it because Civil War is about to happen, and then a lot of this is better constructed when you get to the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff. So this is good. I like Execute Program. I think it's an enjoyable read. I think the art in places is really good. I don't particularly care for the way the armor in some panels is drawn a little bit too sketchy. It's particularly a problem with the faceplate, because the faceplate is supposed to feel really smooth, and when it's too sketchy, that it makes the armor's whole aesthetic kind of feel off. So yeah, I'm not crazy about some of the ways this guy draws the armor, but aside from that, it's really good art, and I do recommend checking it out. You don't have to read Extremis to get this. You don't have to be a big Iron Man fan to get this. I think it works pretty well on its own as an introduction to the character. So definitely check this out. I think this is good. And let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. And I'll be back with you next time to talk about Iron Man Civil War.